And when you have a lot of exiles, you feel much more delicate because so many different things could trigger them. And if they get triggered, it's really scary. It's like flames of emotion burst out and overwhelm you. So you feel much more delicate. And the world seems a lot more dangerous because there are so many things that could trigger them. And because of that, a bunch of other parts who before the trauma were also in their valuable roles are forced to become what we call protectors. And so some of them take on roles designed to manage your life so that these exiles never get triggered. And so they might try to manage your relationships so that no one gets close enough to trigger you, or manage your appearance so that you look good all the time and nobody rejects you for it, or manage your performance so you get a lot of accolades to counter the worthlessness that some of these exiles feel, or become this massive caretaking part that many therapists have and many women are socialized to have in general, that makes you take care of everybody else and not take care of yourself, or manage your body so that you're kind of numb and you're out of your body a little bit so that you don't feel so much when things happen, and so on and so on. So I'm talking now about some of the common, what we call manager roles that most people have some degree, and people with a lot of trauma have them in spades. And so one class of protector becomes these managers. And again, they're just trying to keep you safe. They're just trying to make it so people like you, or trying to control the external world so you don't get triggered. And they're working their asses off. They're just constantly vigilant and at work like that. And many of them become these inner critics because they don't know what else to do to get you to behave and yell at you. And they saw that you did behave when your parent yelled at you, so they take on that voice. And they're what in family therapy we used to call parentified children. They're children inside of you that had to take on a kind of parental role, they thought, to try and keep you safe. Or some of these inner critics are really just trying to tear down your confidence so you don't take any risks. And that's a way to keep you safe. So these we call the managers, and everybody in that room has a bunch of managers who got you where you are, got you through graduate school and so on. And they deserve a lot of credit, but they're stressed. They're tired of having to work so hard, and they're in over their heads. And they also are afraid of the other class of protector, because when an exile gets triggered, like I said, it's a big emergency. It's like these flames of emotion are going to overwhelm you. And so there's another set of parts who are on standby. And if that ever happens, or there's a threat of that happening, they'll immediately go into action in an impulsive way, a reactive way, to get you away from those feelings, those flames of emotion, which is why we call them firefighters. They're fighting the fire of exile emotion. And they, in contrast to the managers, who are all about control and pleasing people usually, and so on, they will be very impulsive and maybe take you out of control and take you toward things that get you higher than the flames, maybe, so addictions and so on, or douse them with some substance, or distract you until they burn themselves out. And so most all of us have a bunch of firefighters who, like I said, are just waiting for this big emergency to happen, for the siren to go off, and for them to have to go into action. And in contrast, again, to the managers, they don't care about the collateral damage that they do to your body or to your relationships. They just think, I've got to get you out of here right now, no matter what it takes. And so most all of us have a kind of hierarchy of firefighter activities. If the first one doesn't work, you go to the next one. If that doesn't work, the next one. At the top of that hierarchy for most everybody is suicide. It's a big, big comfort to know that if the flames get hot enough, there's this exit strategy. And so increasing numbers of people are taking that exit strategy now. And the big problem in our culture and in ourselves and in our therapy is that most systems are designed to fight and try to control firefighters. And that, if you succeed, then that firefighter is now in exile also, and has still got the impulse, but you're going to have to become even more managed to try and contain it. You become a dry drunk. It's a white knuckle recovery because you're always worried about getting triggered and that firefighter is going to take over. And if you don't succeed, then in reaction to all the control attempts, the firefighter will just get more and more extreme and more damaging. And that's the state of the art. That's the way we are. One of the things I'm trying to do these days is to really change the paradigm around addictions and help people go with a lot of appreciation and love to their addicted parts rather than try to control them so much. And it's, as you can imagine, it's a really tough sell. So that's the map to the territory. It's pretty simple. Again, exiles, managers, and firefighters. And that's held up pretty well over these 40 years. Now, the big deal about IFS and where it is different from most any other psychological approach, but is also quite similar to most spiritual approaches, is that in addition to these parts I've been describing, and again, just to reiterate, I'm only describing, I was just describing the extreme roles they're forced into, not their nature. So once released from these roles, they'll become these wonderful, valuable inner qualities. But as I was working with them, again, from my family therapy background, trying to get once I got hip to the fact they're not what they seem and they deserve to be listened to, I tried to do what I did in families, which was to have two people talk to each other and keep them from getting extreme with each other so they start to listen and get to know and maybe change their relationship. So I started doing that at first with that open share technique, but then one client said, you know, I don't really have to jump around to do this. I can just sit here and do it. So basically since then, most people just sit there and do it and have them listen to rather than fight with the critic, for example, or some other part like that. And so I'm doing that. Let's say I am having a bulimic kid talk to her critic and try to listen instead of fight with it. And suddenly she's furious with the critic and the conversation is breaking down. And as a family therapist, I was taught that if you have two people talking to each other and one of them gets extreme with the other, look around the room and see if somebody isn't covertly allying with that extreme person. And often you'll find that that's true. And then you get that third person to step back in the room out of the line of vision, create a better boundary around the other two, and things go well. Maybe the same thing's happening in this inner system. Maybe as I'm trying to have my client talk to her critic in this example, some other part that hates the critic has jumped in and is doing the talking. And so I began asking clients, could you find that one? And could you ask it to just relax back and let you keep talking to this critter? And to my amazement, clients would say, okay, it did. And I'd say, okay, now how do you feel toward it? And it would be a completely different answer, like from a completely different person, often in the direction of, I'm just kind of curious about why it calls me names. Said from a place of calm, confidence, and often even compassion. Whereas seconds earlier, they hated the part and wanted to get rid of it. And as I tried this with other clients, it was like the same person would pop out with those same C-word qualities. Calm, confident, curious, compassionate. And for others, clarity, creativity, courage, and connectedness. And as I did that over and over with a bunch of clients, and it was again, like the same person would pop out, just by getting these other parts to open space, I began to get excited because I started thinking, maybe you don't have to practice and learn the art of compassion. Maybe it's just in there, covered over by these parts. And now 40 years later and thousands of people later, I can definitively say that that's true. That simply by getting the parts to open space, you very quickly access what I came to call the self with a capital S. And I called it that because when I would ask clients, what part of you is that? They'd say, that's not me, that's myself. I mean, that's not a part, that's myself, or that's me. So I call it the self with a capital S to distinguish it from the ordinary use of the word self. And it turns out that that self with those qualities and a bunch of other qualities that I didn't include, mainly because they don't begin with the letter C and I like alliteration, but those 8 C's are the ones that are most relevant to the healing endeavor. That self is in everybody, can't be damaged, knows how to heal, and like I said, is just beneath the surface of these parts. And that's a big deal. That is the big deal about IFS, that self can be accessed that quickly. And as I was discovering this and trying to find analogs in other fields, other schools of psychology unsuccessfully, some students said, well, because I wasn't at all spiritual at the time. I come from a very scientific, sort of atheistic family. Some students said, well, this sounds like Atman in Hinduism, or this sounds like Buddha nature in Buddhism, or and so on and so on. And so as I began to look into that, indeed, virtually every spiritual tradition has a word for this and knows about it. And again, virtually no other psychotherapies do. And actually co-authored a book on that whole topic where we looked at all of those spiritual traditions and how they frame it. And in contrast to IFS, many of them believe you have to meditate for 20 years to get access to it, instead of it being just beneath the surface. So when we're working with clients, I'll have them focus on a part that they want to work with. Usually it's a part that bothers them in some way. And then I'll ask this sort of self-detecting question. How do you feel toward that part of you? And in answering that question, they're telling me how much of their self is present versus other parts. So if they immediately say, I'm just curious about it, then we can proceed because we have access to enough self. If in contrast they say, I don't like it, or I'm afraid of it, or yeah, drives me crazy. That wouldn't be self. Self would never say anything like that. So I'll say, okay, I can understand why you don't like it and want to get rid of it, but let's just see if the part that feels that way would give us a chance to get to know it and maybe help it rather than fight it. And if that part is willing to separate, then I'll say, now how do you feel toward the original, the target part? And I'll get, if I get a self answer, then we can proceed. But we don't have people start to get to know these parts until they have what we call the critical mass of self. Enough self that we trust it's going to go well. We don't want to harass the parts, and we don't want the person to fear them too much. So, so we start that way, and you know, if I have enough time, I can give you a little taste of this. I think maybe I'll shift because I want to make sure we have time to do an experiential piece. So if you want to do this, and there's no pressure to, but if you want to give it a try, think of a part of you that you don't like, you wish you could change, that seems to get in your way in some form. And it could be one of these critics, because most all of us have one of those. But just take a second and think of a part you want to maybe get to know that seems to screw up your life. And when you have a part in mind, raise your hand. Okay, I'll give you another minute maybe, because only about half of you raised your hands. Okay, let's try it again. How many of you have a target part? Okay, we can go ahead then. All right, so focus on it and see if you can notice where it seems to be located or broadcasting from in your body or around your body. And you might want to close your eyes, but you don't have to. And then as you notice it, also notice how you feel toward it. And if you do have an attitude toward it, then ask the part that doesn't like it or is afraid of it or whatever the attitude is, ask that part if it's willing to let you just get to know this other one, the target part, for a few minutes. We're not going to give it more power. We're just going to get to know it a little bit and see if the parts with the attitude will relax back just for a few minutes. And if they won't, then you can just spend the time getting to know them and their fears about stepping out. What are they afraid would happen if they did let you get to know this other part? But if they are willing to separate and relax, then notice
on these tracks. Well, now you see why I'm the most feared driver on the circuit. I'll earn the right to face oxide by crushing you into brick dust. Let's race.
now how you feel toward the target part, the original part. And if you can, or you have gotten to that place of at least curiosity about it, then it's safe to go ahead and begin to get to know it. And you can start with the very simple question, what does it want you to know about itself? So direct that question toward that
Activision presents.
And then don't think of the answer. Just wait and see what comes back to you. And if nothing comes, that's okay. So again, we're asking the question of it, what does it want you to know about itself? And just waiting for an answer. And then a good next question is, what's it afraid would happen if it didn't do this inside of you? And again, just wait for the answer, don't think. What's it afraid would happen if it didn't do this job? Then another question is, ask it if you could heal or change what it's afraid would happen, so that wasn't such a threat, and it was freed up, so it didn't have to do this job anymore. What might it like to do instead inside of you? It's a little bit of a complicated question, so I'll repeat it. If you could heal or change what it's trying to protect from happening, so it was liberated from this role, what might it like to do instead inside of you? And we're just waiting for the answer. And then another interesting question for a part like this is, how old does it think you are? Not how old is it, but how old does it think you are? And if it got that wrong, then go ahead and let it know how old you are and see how it reacts. And then the final question for it is, what does this part need from you going forward in your life? Or what would it like from you? And then when the time feels right, thank the part for whatever it lets you do, or your other parts, and begin to shift your focus back out here. But let them know this won't be the last time you'll get to know them this way. If it helps, you can take some deep breaths as you come back. Now, do we have the ability to hear from the audience about what this was like? I don't know if there's a mic you could pass around. So I would love to get a few reports about it.
So I'm just going to repeat it now to Dick so he can hear it, okay? So this gentleman is facing a long-term illness, and he was looking for courage while he was doing the exercise. So there's a willingness to let go of the need to do too much, and his body is telling him to do less rather than more at this time. Is that right to say, David? Yeah.
So maybe you focused on the symptom and got curious about it, and you heard from your body that there's a part of you that makes you do too much. Does that sound right?
So he's saying what he really needs is rest and recovery, and he got that from the exercise.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So often when you start with one part, you wind up hearing from parts that are polarized with it. And a common polarization is between the part that drives you so hard to constantly work and all the parts who you don't listen to, who tell you to relax more and rest. So it sounds like that's what you ran into. Let me just ask this, raise your hand if you had an interesting experience with this. Yeah. So ideally you met a protector and you got the parts that have an attitude to let you get to know it. And as you got to know it, you learned it wasn't what you thought, and that it's actually trying to help in its own way, and that it's stuck in the past, that it really believes you're much younger than you are. And often these protectors they don't believe it when you tell them how old you really are. But once they do believe it, they're tremendously relieved, because they got into the role at the age that they give you when you ask how old they think you are. And they've just been stuck in that role ever since. So it's a big relief to know there is somebody else in there who can run your life for a lot of these parts. So, I asked the common questions we ask of protectors, which is, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't do this job? And in answering that question, often we learn about the exiles that it protects. If it didn't do this job, you might feel someone might hurt you, or you might feel ashamed, you might feel worthless, or so on and so on. But other times you'll hear about a part it's polarized with. So if it didn't give you the symptom, you would just keep working your ass off, and you would never relax. And so this symptom part is really, this physical symptom part is really just trying to get your attention, to get you away from that driven part. So that question brings up the system, what this protector is protecting. And then that next question, if we could change that or heal it, would this part be freed up, is what I call becoming a hope merchant. We're trying to let these parts know that there's a different way, and give them some hope of change. And then we didn't take the next steps. The next steps are to negotiate permission from the protector to go to what it protects, so we can heal or change it. And that can be a tough sell. A lot of these protectors really, really fear that other part. And we've gotten very good at addressing those fears. In my books, we talk about, there's like 9 or 10 common protector fears about letting us go to exiles. And we now know how to address each of those fears. So I might have to do some of that for a while, because we don't go to exiles without permission from protectors. And that's another big characteristic of IFS that's different from many other systems. Because too many other systems can bypass protectors and get you access to exiles. And then people have what we call backlash, when the protectors are pissed off that you didn't listen to them and you just went past them. So we say we get permission, then focus on that pain or that worthlessness or that terror in there. How do you feel toward it? And we don't go to it until we get enough self. The answer being, I'm at least curious about it, or I'm sorry, I feel compassion for it. Okay, then let it know that. So now we're starting to have you have a relationship with one of your exiles. A lot of times the exile is really pissed at you because you abandoned it. And it takes a while to earn its trust. But once you do, once the part seems to trust that you care about it, then the next steps for healing an exile involve asking the part where it's stuck in the past, or some version of that question. Ask the part what happened when it got these extreme beliefs and emotions in the past. And you start to get memories or maybe not. Maybe it's not a, you know, a video you're getting. Maybe it's just some sensations that come, or some intense emotion without a lot of video. But it turns out these parts want desperately to be witnessed. So for you to finally get what happened to them when they got these burdens in the past and how bad it was. So you become a compassionate witness to your own history. And we'll do that until, in asking the part, is this everything or is there more? The part says, no, you finally get it. Now you get what happened. So that's completing the witnessing phase. And then I would say to you, okay, I want you now to go into that scene and be with that little boy or girl in the way he or she needed at the time. And then you would say, okay, I'm there. How are you being with him? Well, I'm just standing next to him. How's he reacting? He's happy he's not alone. He's really glad I'm there. See if there's something he wants you to do with him or for him back there before we take him out to a good, safe place. And sometimes these parts want you to go beat up the abuser for him, or want you to tell your parent to stop saying these things to you, or whatever it is they want. And then you go and do it for the little guy or with him until he feels like he's ready to leave with you. And then you take him out of that time to a safe place, which could be the present. You might bring him right to your lap or something, or to a fantasy place of his choice. And that you set that up for him. And once these exiles feel retrieved, that's called the retrieval. Once they're retrieved from the past and they trust they never have to go back, and they're in a safe environment, then most of the time they're willing to unload the feelings and beliefs they got back there. So that would be the next question. I would say, ask this part if it's ready to unload those feelings and beliefs that it got in that time. And again, most of the time, if it really trusts that it's safe, the answer will be yes. And then ask the part where it carries all that in its body or on its body. And amazingly, parts can identify that most of the time. And then ask what it would like to give all that up to. Light, water, fire, wind, earth, anything else, the elements, basically. And the part picks one of those, and we set that up, and it takes it out of its body and puts it into the water or the light, the fire, until it's all unburdened. And sometimes parts carry many different burdens. And then ask the part how it feels without all that. And I would say 90% of the time, the answer is much lighter. The part says it feels much lighter. And now it wants to go play. And before it goes and plays, tell it if it wants to, it can invite qualities into its body it'd like to have, and see what comes into it. And people can identify these wonderful qualities coming into the exile now. And then that's a complete piece of healing. And then we invite the protector to come in and check this out and see how it reacts to this change. And if it's now interested in a new role. So again, another aspect of IFS that's different and controversial in the addictions world for sure, is that we don't expect these protectors to change, usually, until what they protect has changed. You follow that? So rather than trying to change the addiction, we ask what it's protecting, we heal that, we come back to the addict part. What do you want to do now that you don't have to get them high all the time? rather than, because a lot of times these parts won't change, these protectors won't change until what they protect has been healed. And that's something I learned the hard way. So that's the process. And a lot of it also involves you as a therapist being in self, which is a whole different topic, and is a lot of what our training programs are about, helping therapists get to know their parts and getting their parts to trust that it's safe to let you from self with all those 8C qualities be with your client. And when you can do that, you'll come to realize doing therapy is just a beautiful experience.
If people prefer, we could go straight into Q&A. I'll leave it up to the audience. What do you guys think? Do you want to go straight into Q&A? Yeah, people are saying Q&A, so let's just do that.
So you'll repeat what they say, I guess.
Yeah, we'll take 2 questions from the Zoom first, and then we'll pass the mic around. Okay, so what is your sense of why mainstream mental health services hold on so tightly to a pathologizing view of mental distress and punish both protectors and exiles when it is so clearly failing trauma survivors through an IFS lens?
Well, that's a tough one. You know, old ideas die hard, and this disease paradigm has really been pushed by pharmaceutical companies, by psychiatry. It's just a tough one to shift away from, and the idea of multiplicity has been pathologized too. And so, as you can imagine, as I've tried to promote this, I've been attacked as promoting something that's fragmenting people and so on. So it's just a big paradigm clash, and many people's careers are built around the old way. So, yeah, I'm not surprised that people hold on to it, but I remain committed to trying to get all that to change.
100%. Okay, so the next one's from Danny Rosenhammer, and this question is, a lot of people seem to have a self-sabotaging part, which often takes the form of procrastination or avoiding challenges, among other things. But I noticed that this was not one of the listed types of protectors in your IFS workbook. Could you please speak a bit about how you would view and categorize such parts and the function they serve in the system?
Yeah, there are parts that are afraid to let you feel too good about yourself, to let you shine or get big or succeed. And they often have good reasons for that fear if you go back into their history. You know, a lot of people were raised in families where if they did show much ego, they would be punished or attacked. And so these parts are stuck back there, and they just really fear you being successful.
Okay, so we're going to pass it around to the audience here now. First question, I want to volunteer for this. Okay, so Gita was saying that she was very moved by the presentation, but she's curious about why you call it internal family systems with the emphasis on family, and why not something else?
Because I'm a family therapist, and there's a direct parallel between internal families and external families. The parts operate much like a dysfunctional, initially, inner family, and I couldn't come up with a better word. I mean, I know there are other systems that talk about the internal boardroom or the internal, I forget what else, but it's just so many parallels between internal families and external families.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so any other questions in the audience, or will I go back to the Zoom Q&A? So she's got the sense that she wants to move forward and she can move forward, but there's another part of her that is holding her back from doing that and preventing her from doing that. Have you got any advice for hoping that in that regard?
Yeah, I would, if I was working with her, I would have her
YOSH1MUTSU
focus on the part that's afraid to move forward, and rather than try to bully it away, just get curious about it, just like we did just now, and find out what it's afraid would happen if it allowed you to move forward, and then basically do the process that I described, so that it can be freed up from that role. But we go to them with utter compassion and curiosity, and they always have some kind of story about why they're afraid to let you move forward.
Okay, so next question. When working with a part, how important is it to separate the part from the body? Is that right? Yeah.
I wouldn't frame it that way. We're having the part separate from you, ultimately from yourself. So we're just asking it to pull its energy out. And sometimes that is out of the body and you notice it outside your body. But more often, you notice it in your body still, but you're not blended. That's our word for it. You're not blended with it anymore. And you can have a relationship with it rather than being it, which is the way often people start. They start very blended with these parts. And we might do what I call direct access. Rather than having the self talk to the part, I would talk to the part first, sort of like I used to do in Gestalt therapy, and try to talk it into separating its energy from self, so then I can hand the baton back to self to talk to it. But yeah, we're not talking necessarily about separating from the body. It's really just unblending from self so that self can help.
Interesting. Okay, so the next part of the question. So this question is essentially, how do you define the self, and in what ways is it similar or in any ways different to the transpersonal self you find in a lot of spiritual traditions?
Yeah, like I said earlier, it's very similar to what many different spiritual traditions, some of whom call it the self, or the Catholic Hinduism calls it Atman, or the self. And yeah, so it's very similar, and there are some transpersonal psychologies that also are derived from these spiritual traditions that have a similar kind of concept. Some of them, however, I would say one of the big differences with IFS from a lot of those is the idea of the self not just being a state to achieve, but becoming a very active internal and external leader in the inner world and the outer world, and that is pretty distinctive to IFS.
The key distinction here is that the self in IFS plays an active role in the healing process, whereas a lot of spiritual traditions will say it's a passive witness or observer of experience. Is that fair to say?
Right. Yes, that is correct.
Okay, next question there. All right, we're not getting questions from the audience here, so I'm going to go to the Q&A again. Okay, so one from Kathy Prentice. Love this therapy. It seems like a safe therapy, but are there any dangers of doing IFS?
Yeah, it's safer in the sense that we have such respect for protectors, and that we don't go past their level of comfort. And what can be dangerous isn't so much IFS as if you're doing it in a context where the client is in danger, then helping them become more vulnerable can be dangerous if they're then are more acting more vulnerably in an external environment that would punish them. So yeah, there are a couple cautions about using IFS, and one is to just be sure that the external environment will allow that kind of vulnerability, and if it won't, So I'm still a family therapist, so I'll still work with that external environment to try and create enough space that people can be this vulnerable. Although working with protectors and helping them trust self still can be done even in dangerous environments and can be quite helpful. And the other issue is if there's something about the client or their situation that's going to trigger you as a therapist, then it's not safe to do IFS, because it's so important that you can stay in cell when you're being allowed into these sacred places inside of clients, because you don't want your protectors to be doing the leading in those places. And that's a challenge, because as your client gets close to certain parts, if you're afraid of the parts of you that resemble those parts, then it's going to be hard for you to stay in cell. And if you're afraid of, or you're polarized with, or you don't like, then so that's why we emphasize so much that therapists do their own IFS, so that their parts really do trust that it's safe to let them stay even when they're being triggered.
Interesting. Okay, so next one here is from Lorraine. I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but I think it's Bogman. Sorry. How can you protect exiles? Won't protectors get angry or overreact whenever you're working with them? And whenever I was reading No Bad Parts, that was one of the things that really jumped out at me from the book, was that you were saying that you should never bypass protectors and go straight to exiles. There's a danger of doing that. Could you maybe expand a bit on that?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, I learned that the hard way because I was doing that. You know, in the early days, I wasn't fully aware of the dangers, and so my bulimic clients or some of the other clients would talk about these parts that were so young and hurt and or felt so worthless. And I thought, well, wow, that's where we need to get to, because that's the core of it all. And I would get there. We would get there, and I would do what I could. I didn't know about the whole process to unburden them. And so my client would access some of that pain, and then the next week, they either wouldn't come back, or they'd come back and tell me they had a terrible week. And some clients, it was actually dangerous what happened. I had a client leave my office and get into a car accident and claim she just didn't see the car. I had clients that would spike a big fever right after a session like that. And so it was with experiences like that, at first they scared the hell out of me, and I decided, oh, I can't keep doing this because it's too dangerous. Then I got curious and I started asking, what am I doing wrong? And these protectors really let me have it and let me know that I was violating their world. I was bypassing them. And they had spent decades trying to contain what I was opening the door to. And they were going to punish my client and punish me for doing that. And so that's when we shifted, and I decided I had to not only get permission and work with protectors first, but over time just came to learn that they needed to be loved too and appreciated for how hard they work to keep the system safe. And that once they feel that level of appreciation and love, then they're much more apt to allow you to go to exiles. And when you go with permission, then you don't get the backlash.
Next question I'm curious to ask is, so in being a human being, everyone's faced with, like, I suppose, major decisions to make at several points in their life. And in the book, you have this dilemma meditation, which I find very, very helpful. How do you make the big decisions in your life? You know, what's your process for working with parts to make these difficult decisions?
Yeah, you know, it's taken a long, long time, but like we recently moved from the Boston area to the Chicago area after being in Boston for a decade or so. And, you know, I had parts that went back and forth, and we came, at my age, you follow the grandkids. So my kids had moved, I'd raised them in Chicago, and then they moved, and then they came back with grandkids. And we would be leaving a lot in the Boston area. But, you know, some years ago, I would be racked with debate inside constantly. And, you know, I would be pulled in one direction and pulled back in the other direction. And now it's because these parts trust my leadership that I'll listen to both sides, and then I'll make the decision like a good leader might, after having gotten input from the board, and my parts trust me enough to let that happen. So it's just a very different process now. And until you have that level of trust of the parts himself, then big decisions are going to be really, really hard.
And building that trust, is it all around, you know, keeping these promises to yourself? And is that, or how do you recommend people do that?
Yeah, it's also healing parts. So I've done a lot of work with my exiles. So the stakes are less high. You know, if a part believes that if you make a mistake, it's going to be a total disaster in your decision, because you're going to feel all the pain that's stored inside if it turns out to be a mistake, then the stakes are very high about making that decision. But if you healed a lot of that pain, then it's not nearly as big a deal to them.
Next one here is from Maria Serdiva. Thank you so much for an insightful lecture. I have a recently diagnosed ADHD. Yeah, I've recently diagnosed ADHD 2 years ago. Since COVID started, and mostly since I got the diagnosis, I have this firefighter part, which not only wants to have fun all the time, but also sabotages all the important and vital tasks. I know this part protects me from coping with too much tasks and commitments with bulimia, and previously and purging subtype, because I'm not doing this anymore, but it also ruins lots of stuff.
Congratulations.
We were talking about parts which prevent us from being seen, successful, childish, or having fun. But what about this part which is the primal one and wants to have fun? I'm an ACT and CFT therapist and also teaching DBT skills to my ADHD clients. So I know how to learn to get things done, but I'm really interested in what IFS would suggest, because this metaphor of parts has been clicking with me for quite a while now. Thank you.
Yeah, again, in contrast to those models, I would have you just go to that part that just wants to have fun and get to know it, get curious about it, and not try to change it. Just getting curious and what's it afraid would happen if it didn't do what it does. And sometimes you're quite surprised by the answers to that. And then negotiate either going to the parts that it's polarized with, like parts that want to have fun often are very polarized with the parts that just work constantly. And they use symptoms to try and get your attention. And so it's possible to go to depolarize by bringing this one who wants to have fun together with the part that doesn't want to have fun, just wants to work, and have them have a dialogue with each other about how they can start to share time in there better. Like, we did an outcome study, for example, with rheumatoid arthritis, and in having people focus on the pain and the arthritis and get curious about it, ask questions of it, it turns out often it was one of these parts that wants to have more fun or more rest, and then is polarized. And this was done in Boston, so this was a bunch of Irish Catholic women who were totally dominated by the caretaking part. that never let them take care of themselves. So the parts that want to have fun and do things for themselves never had any access. So they were using the pain to try and sabotage and try to make it so the client couldn't keep caretaking all the time. And once we worked that out, so we got the two of them together and had them negotiate a time-sharing arrangement, the arthritis got much better. Some people went into complete remission, and that's been published in the Journal of Rheumatology. So, yeah, so there's a lot of IFS work around polarization. And again, back to that question of why do I call it internal family systems? Because that's what I was doing with families. I was finding these polarized family members and getting them to come together and actually talk about, what do you guys have in common? The answer is usually, well, we both want what's good for the family. When you have parts come together, you ask that question, what do you have in common? Well, we both live in this person. We both want what's good for the person. We just have opposite ideas about what that is. And then you can begin the negotiation, and you have self become the mediator. Self becomes the therapist to these polarized parts.
Interesting. Okay, so next one's from Hannah Theodoro. I'm wondering how you help identify the self with those complex clients who are very fragmented, such as DID or psychosis.
Yeah, so with clients, for example, with that diagnosis of DID, it's not hard to identify the parts, but it is hard to get access to any self. And that's because many of those clients, their abusers knew that if they had any of those C-word qualities, then the abusers would be in danger. So they would deliberately torture more when they would see self. And so the parts came to associate self with more torture and decide that they're going to take over and they're not going to let self out at all. And so we wind up doing a lot more what I call direct access, where I'm becoming the self to the system and I'm talking to the parts directly. And we'll, I'm asking the same questions and we're doing the same negotiating. It's just that for a period of time, I'm the self to the system. And then once they trust me and they're more depolarized and once they have enough trust, then I'll start to ask if they're willing to step out. And there's a huge resistance to that because, again, they really think that as soon as they do and self shows up, they're going to get more torture. So it's a big transition point, but I succeeded with many DID clients in getting their parts to open space, and it's the same damn self that shows up. And then I hand the baton off to the self, and the the parts feel betrayed because they're all attached to me. They don't know this other person, and there's a shitstorm of anger at me, and they feel betrayed. So we got to work through all of that and help them see I'm not going anywhere, but there is this other person inside who can do a lot more than you think.
So you temporarily step into the role of self so that the parent or the client can sort of model that, and there's like training wheels there, and then you gradually take off the training wheels and let them embody that role themselves.
Yeah, it isn't so much training wheels because I'm not training. It was those clients who, when we finally got their parts to open space and their self popped out, convinced me that self can't be damaged because it's just there. I mean, these are people who had horrible abuse on a daily basis throughout their childhood. If you believe anything about, like attachment theory, you'd think there's no way they could have any of these qualities because attachment theory says it has to come from the outside. It has to come in a relationship. But I was finding that it was the same self as for people who had decent childhoods. So that's what blew my mind. And I really had to I love attachment theory. I love many, many things about it, but that one assumption really gets in the way. It's just very different from the IFS assumption. And, it's, I think, probably different from most other parts approaches.
So then just building on the attachment theory thing you've mentioned there, do you think IFS is a technology or a way to create secure attachment later in life for people that are insecurely attached?
Yeah. What our goal is for self to become the primary caretaker of these insecure parts so that other people like therapists or spouses and so on